This session is called 60-Year Anniversary of Endless U.S. War in Korea. We have an all-star lineup, and I guarantee you that you will walk away tonight moved, inspired, and better informed of how the unended Korean War influences the geopolitics of the region. By now, you've learned much about the Asia-Pacific and U.S. designs to maintain its dominance over the region through aggressive economic expansion and the use of military force. What many people don't know or realize is that one country, in the last century and today, plays a central role in justifying U.S. military expansion in the Asia-Pacific. This country is Korea. Bruce Cummings, the foremost historian of Korea, who unfortunately is unable to be here with us today, writes, quote, "It was the Korean War, not Greece or Turkey or the Marshall Plan or Vietnam, that inaugurated big defense budgets and the national security state, that transformed a limited containment doctrine into a global crusade, that ignited McCarthyism just as it seemed to fizzle, and thereby gave the Cold War its long run," end quote. Well, just as over 60 years ago, today, North Korea's so-called belligerence legitimates U.S. aggression in the Asia-Pacific. Following North Korea's successful launch of a satellite last December and subsequent testing of its third nuclear weapon, the U.S. led the United Nations Security Council on another round of sanctions, this time enlisting the participation of China. North Korea responded with heightened rhetoric, renouncing the Korean War armistice and threatening, if it were attacked, to strike U.S. and South Korean targets. The key qualifier missed in the U.S. media was if. This event set off a firestorm of militaristic responses, including an unprecedented show of force by the U.S. through its joint war exercises with South Korea. In these war games, the U.S. deployed nuclear-capable B-2 stealth bombers over South Korea, planes with the capacity to drop 30,000-pound bombs solely developed to destroy North Korea's underground facilities, and the nuclear power submarine USS Cheyenne, equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Last December, former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta said the U.S. has been, quote, "within an inch of war almost every day," end quote, with North Korea. Well, the truth is, Mr. Panetta, that the U.S. is still at war with North Korea. After 4 million mostly Korean, mostly civilian lives were taken, the Korean War came to an unresolved end on July 27, 1953, with a temporary armistice signed by the U.S., North Korea, and China. There were 3 main provisions of this armistice. Number 1, within 3 months, a permanent peace settlement would be negotiated. This never happened. Number 2, all foreign troops were to leave, which China removed their troops. The U.S. still has 28,500 U.S. troops on about 80 bases and satellites throughout South Korea. Number 3, no new weapons would be introduced in Korea, which of course the U.S. violated by introducing and maintaining a nuclear weapon in the South up until the first Bush administration. This history is absolutely crucial to understanding the present. The unended Korean War has everything to do with the current crisis on the Korean Peninsula. It's easy to blame North Korea as the belligerent one, when in fact, the Asia-Pacific pivot and the U.S.-South Korean war games, which involved tens of thousands of U.S. and South Korean troops simulating an invasion and occupation of North Korea, is naturally freaking North Korea out. The reality is that North Korea plays a perfect boogeyman for the U.S. to contain China, without actually even saying so. And it provides a perfect sales pitch for Lockheed Martin, for Boeing, and Northrop Grumman. Since Hillary Clinton announced the Asia-Pacific pivot in 2011, the U.S. weapons manufacturing industry has, despite global economic recession, increased sales by 5%, and forecasts of sales are on the rise, with Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, and other U.S. allies in the checkout line. Further elaborating on this tonight will be UC Santa Cruz Professor Christine Hong, who will speak about the current U.S.-North Korean crisis and how North Korea serves as an invaluable justification for Washington to consolidate its permanent war posture in the Asia-Pacific region. But the crisis in Korea is more than a military or geopolitical one. The militarization resulting from the unended war has tremendous costs we never hear about. Recently, at a UCLA conference on ending the Korean War, a young Korean-American woman stood up and she asked why her generation should care about reunification when the cost would be too prohibitive for South Korea to rescue an impoverished South or North. Well, I challenged her to reframe her question and ask, what's the cost of maintaining division and a permanent state of war? It's not just in the misspending of scarce public dollars in preparation for war, which drains public coffers everywhere. And we, as Bruce Gagnon so eloquently put it, we, of all people, here in the United States, knows what it's like to spend every last dollar on the military-industrial complex, while 1 in 4 children in this country goes to bed hungry. The costs of repression on both sides of the DMZ are never also talked about in the name of national security, including in so-called democratic South Korea, where the Cold War national security law labels trade unionists, environmentalists, and other peace and social justice activists as communists, and serves to silence and censor most ordinary people from speaking out. I'm speaking of the human rights crisis in North Korea, fueled by 60 years of US-led sanctions, which have devastated North Korea's economy and forced its people into destitution. I'm speaking of the crisis facing Korean women whose male partners are conscripted into the military and then later turns the violence he learned in the military towards the women around him. I'm speaking of the sexual violence virtually every single North Korean woman, migrant, young or old, will face in her journey for economic survival. Without a doubt, Korean patriarchy is complicit in all of this, but also sitting behind the wheel is its big brother, the US forces in Korea. In 2006, I saw how the unended war and its various manifestations were directly bearing down on rice farmers who were being displaced from their lands to accommodate the expansion of Camp Humphreys, US military base. After crossing 2 military checkpoints, passing 200 armed police in riot gear, I arrived late at night and was brought to a barn where dozens of villagers were holding candles in their palms. It was their 811th consecutive candlelight vigil, where they met nightly after a hard day of nonviolent resistance to remind themselves what they were fighting for: their families, their community, their land, their livelihoods, their dignity. I looked around at the room of mostly elderly rice farmers whose faces were browned and their hands were leathered from spending their entire lives working the land. I looked at them, and in my broken Korean, I told them that it is because of my adopted nation's alleged security that is displacing you from the land that you depend on for your survival. Today, instead of lush rice fields and a vibrant community, there stands within the barbed wire fences of Camp Humphreys a Starbucks, a golf course, and water slides.